So we're here today to talk about soil and sediment. We're excited to hear from regulators and other practitioners. We're going to begin a series of brief presentations, followed by a moderated discussion. So our presenters and additional panelists, and are going to be sharing their expertise, and we're leaving plenty of time after that moderated discussion for your questions. So if any time through the presentation you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, or to indicate that you have a question, or put your question actually in the chat. I'm gonna make sure I see everybody. Really threw me off. So we begin today. I want to remind folks that there's really two areas of sediment that we're concerned with today, and we'll be talking about. So it involved in most beneficial use or ecological restoration projects. So the sediment source, which is usually a waterway, and the sediment destination, which is usually our restoration site. For the projects completed thus far, at least in New Jersey, regulations and sediment testing requirements cover the source material. We're hoping today to not only shed light on those regulations and put them in context with these projects, but also gather some additional recommendations or guidelines for assessing the sediment destination and that suitability. So our presenters today, as I said, come from a variety of backgrounds and experience with beneficial use projects. And we hope through their introductory presentations and then the moderated discussion will all increase our understanding both what must be tested in addition to what should be tested while we're developing compliant and successful beneficial use restoration projects. We'll begin with the regulatory context to characterize both what's required and then additional recommendations that folks have. I'll introduce our panelists one by one. Bill, if you wouldn't mind, start to share the presentation. Perfect, thank you. Oh, and I had a hokey joke about how sediment is the foundation of all objects. You guys can smile about that. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Suzanne Began. She works for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, Division of Land Resource Protection, Office of Dredging and Sediment Technology. She's been working for DEP for over 30 years, primarily in the regulation of dredging and dredged material management in tidal waters of New Jersey. Her office is responsible for the permitting of engineering with nature projects and involves the beneficial use of dredged material. The engineering with nature projects that involve the beneficial use of dredged material. The office has issued permits for a number of these types of projects in coordination with New Jersey Department of Transportation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Army Corps of Engineers, and local municipalities. So with that, Suzanne, I welcome you to, I think you have slide control now, or you will soon, and you can begin your presentation. Thanks so much for being here.
Suzanne, do you have control? You should have it.
Suzanne, you're muted still.
There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of go through the regulatory process and some of the, as we've done some of these projects over the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, some of the regulatory, hiccups related to sediment sampling of the, as you're saying, the source location and that associated with the Engineered with Nature project. I want to first give a shout out to our Blue Acres program with this picture of Money Island Engineered with Nature project, which utilized dredge material from an adjacent state navigation channel that was being dredged by NJDOT. And the material was used in a habitat restoration project for the overall benefit of horseshoe crabs and red knot. project was completed without a hiccup. And as you can see, they also, beyond just the beach restoration, they also did incorporate a number of breakwater and living shoreline structures to, in an effort to protect the beaches, the beach that they have restored. No, this is a big slide, but wanted to give you kind of where we are with the regulation of NJDE of engineer with nature projects. The Division of Land Resource Protection is the lead agency within the DEP that issues the regulatory permits, and we regulate development, living shorelines, and other nature-based solutions through primarily in tidal waters, the coastal zone management rules, and then in inland areas, as we refer to them, and under our Flood Hazard Area Control Act and our Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act. Each of these governing regulations, we have also set forth general permits for a large number of engineer with nature projects that we cover under our umbrella of habitat restoration projects. And that's an effort to obviously make the permitting process go a little quicker, a little smoother than requiring what normally is done for projects of this type, which would be an individual permit process. We also are in the currently within our rule writing proposals, trying to expand the type of projects that we can cover under these engineered with nature project general permits and or the regulatory requirements that are set forth in those GPs. Can I advance this a little bit? Can I move this around, Bill?
When you say move around,
Oh, your control slide, yeah, you should be able to hover over it and just move.
And pull it up a little bit, or?
It to a different place, potentially. It's invisible to us. Sorry, Susan.
Okay, that's fine. I can kind of speak. I was trying to see below. So typically, if you're designing an engineered with nature project and you're looking to use dredge material, more than likely what we've seen is that the source of the material will be at a navigation, from a navigation channel, either that's federal, state, or municipal. We've had some projects approach us to use municipal channel also. Very important early on in that process to work with the material source entity and develop a sediment sampling and analysis plan. We have streamlined this form, and that is referenced here. And that is a way of, for the source location and the engineered with nature design team to collect all the necessary information that you would need in order to design your project, and also to make sure that the material that you're accepting in the design of your project is acceptable and it will serve the purpose of the engineer with nature project. Kind of a big list here, but as you can see, I kind of, the first one straight out is geotechnical. We have found that there definitely is a need to go kind of above and beyond the normal sampling that may be done for a dredging project to collect enough information about the source material for your engineered with nature project. And then in addition, looking at bulk sediment chemistry, and in some of the inland projects, we do also require that there be a leachate analysis of the source material, and so that there's an evaluation of that also related to any potential groundwater impacts. Lastly, there also is a need in some instances for evaluating the surface water discharge or runoff that may come from the placement of the material on an engineered with nature project. One of the things that I will say that over the years has become very important is also collecting, when you're out there at the navigation project location, collecting any available background information in and around the project, engineered with nature project, and the dredging project. And I can, when I go to the next slide, I can kind of explain why we've sort of shifted gears in looking at a background information instead of having a comprehensive evaluation of the destination marsh, potentially, as a way to kind of do a mini risk assessment on the placement of dredge material on an engineered with nature project. So again, very busy, but what we have been asking a lot of these projects to do is to develop a comprehensive sediment data comparison to any and all of the governing criteria that are within the department. And as you can see in bulk sediment chemistry, obviously looking at the ecological soil screening criteria, looking at residential, non-residential soil criteria, evaluating your leachate data against the groundwater quality standards, surface water against the surface water quality standards. And the one on the right, you know, I can't stress enough that over the years we've been again, instead of looking at bright line, oh, you're above the residential, you're above the ecological screening criteria, it's a no-go on the placement of the material on this engineered with nature project. We're looking at doing a comprehensive, you know, contaminant profile, and then evaluating that data with the project team and the DEP collectively to determine whether or not this is a type of project that, or type of source material that should go on the engineered with nature project. Just to give you a couple of examples, recently we've been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in their Good Luck Point Marsh Restoration Project, and we actually had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife contaminant group do exactly what is shown in this on this table, is a quasi mini risk assessment that says, you know, yes, we realize that there may be exceedances of the ecological soil screening criteria, but we have background information, and we also are looking at it from an order of magnitude. And they made a determination, and we supported it in their application to say, yes, we would like to accept this material, and we do not, from a risk standpoint, do not believe that it will cause unnecessary harm in its application in the engineered with nature project. We also did the same thing with NJDOT recently with their what's referred to as dredge hole 86. Same process. Their consultant developed a comprehensive report that did a full you know, vetting of all the data and comparison to all the different criteria that are listed here. So that is a shift from the way that we had been previously handling these engineered with nature projects. And I would say that's a big lesson learned on behalf of the DEP in trying to move these projects through, as well as beneficial use of dredge material. There's my information, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak this afternoon.
Clay, you should have control now.
All right, thank you very much. Yep, looks like I do. Okay, thank you. My name's Clay Stern. I'm with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, stationed out of the New Jersey field office. Many of you probably know Eric Schrading. He's our project leader. This is his shop. And I am in the program of environmental response and restoration. We handle NERDAR sort of matters, spill preparedness and response. Okay, so when you think about these sort of sites, you know, the questions I look at, not so much, but to an extent as a regulator, are the source sample sediments representative of the whole? So DOT says, well, I've got 4 cores here. We've mixed them up really good. We've submitted them. We've had them analyzed. They generally do it pursuant to the management and regulation dredging activities and dredging materials in New Jersey Tidal Wetlands Manual. I think it was dated back about 1997. So I take the assumption that given the statistical design and whatnot of how they do things, that it's as representative as we can get given the cost of doing these things. And believe me, that this is not a cheap rodeo that we're entering in here when we do these sort of things. One of the things I've not seen frequently, though, is a analysis of the existing and or historical sources of contamination near those sites where they're going to be pulled. And for the most part, the ones we've looked at along the Jersey Shore and Delaware, the southern Jersey Shore, it's mostly recreational boating. It's not like we're sitting on the edge of Port Elizabeth. Notwithstanding, there could be some other historical sources that could have contributed contamination, both of the point and non-point source. The question that Suzanne alluded to a little earlier is, what analytes should we be quantifying? And what criteria are acceptable? And Suzanne was laying that all out very nicely earlier on what we should and should but not be looking at. And then how can we evaluate that sediment quality from the source area? So this is some data that we recently did for around the Shad Island as part of adding beneficial use sediments to the east pool of the Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge. So from a regulatory point of view, the only authority I have here really is the Refuge Improvement Act, Refuge System Improvement Act. I'm technical. I provide technical support to NJDEP, EPA, or the Corps of Engineers when requested, and the DOT. In this particular matter, our refuge people want to know, is this stuff suitable for placement on our refuge? And the general list that we get are these compounds here with their EPA methods. The method number is more important than the last alpha number there, the A or the E or whatever. Those generally relate to how the what the laboratory chose as the method, and it really has to do with quality control and sharing samples or splitting samples and stuff of that nature. So if you're getting, for instance, with the polychlorinated biphenyls, EPA 1668A, it really doesn't matter if it's A, B, or C. You're going to get the same numbers in the end. It more has to do with how the quality control program is executed in the laboratory. So these are the sort of things we're looking at. Grain size, it goes down to your geotechnical. I can't overstress the need for organic carbon to properly interpret the data. This is a good list. It's not the only list. It can be added to, but it does get after the contaminants of concern for wildlife if you were going to put this into an area like a national wildlife refuge or a state wildlife management area. There we go, moving it along. Standards versus criteria. And again, Suzanne touched on this. Standards are rules, they're enforceable. Criteria are recommendations, they're guidance, they're not enforceable. The only standards that we have available are based in human health. I'm not aware of anywhere in the United States where there are standards for the protection of aquatic life or benthics. It's all criteria. Wildlife standards just are not out there. So be it. But one of the things you'll see if you get one of these reports from the Corps of Engineers and they're doing dredging routinely in the past is they will take, and normally if they put it into a confined disposal zone upland, they'll use the most stringent soil remediation standards under the NJAC at 26D for soils. And that second column gives you just an indication of some of the ones that we might look at. If you look at it from an ecological point of view, where the animal is living in it, swimming in it, eating the dirt, and doing all kinds of other things and other testing, this isn't human health based anymore. This is ecologically based on injuries to benthic macroinvertebrates. So the standards here are collected from all kinds of places, best available science, and the NJDEP's got a fabulous list of them out there. Been vetted through a lot of good scientists. Again, I'm going to stress this is for the protection of benthic macroinvertebrates, and they need not necessarily be protective of higher trophic organisms such as mink or birds, where some of these compounds like DDT and the PCBs can biomagnify orders of magnitude in concentration as they move through trophic levels. Can you move that along for me? It's not seeming to want to move along on my keyboard.
Hold on a sec. Is that it?
Yeah, that'll do. Some from the same study out at Shad Island. One of the things we can do with the data, which is historically done by most people, is they compare them to the ESCs, the ecological screening criteria that states put forward. The 4 composite samples here, 4 sites, 2009, 2019, 1 through 4. I've given you a couple of examples where there were exceedances outlined in bold. And if we look along the bottom line, we see the geometric mean of those samples. You'll notice that the organics were normalized to 1% organic carbon. If you go back through the literature and look at how these numbers were generated, they were all standardized, usually against 1 or 2% organic carbon. And that becomes very important because organic carbon drives bioavailability. So if you have 10% organic carbon out there, you may find that although, yeah, we've got a lot of the contaminant there, it's bound up so tightly that it's not as bioavailable. And so reducing these things to 1% organic carbon gives us an indication of comparing apples to apples when we're looking at the standards. And so for the most part, you can see that, gee, in that first column, we have arsenic, the criteria is 8.2, in that first sample, it's 10. Is that significantly different? Probably not, because again, we've picked the most stringent value here for the saline waters, which include the sediments. And so, really here, there's nothing screaming here except for that one PAH, the methylnaphthalene, that has occasionally pops up. And I don't know why it does. PAHs, oils, occur in mixtures. They rarely ever stand alone. And these particular samples, I remember, there was almost non-detectable concentrations of any of the other base neutral polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons around, and yet this one kept popping up. Not really sure why, but it does, but it's not known for a high level of toxicity by any means. I want you to take note of the PCB number here. 23 nanograms per gram, 23 parts per billion with a B. And our total value here was 9.2. That's really a good protective number. The number I like to use when I'm doing other work on Superfund sites is 20 parts per billion. And I'll explain that a little bit later as we get through the slide. So if we could advance it to the next one. Aside from just looking at the screening criteria, we can also go back into the literature. This was out of McDonald, Don McDonald and Chris Ingersoll and Berger from ES&T, where they looked at the hazard quotients using the more elevated levels that would be considered probable toxicity, and then dividing the numbers to get a quotient. And if you go through that, if the quotient is not above 0.5, they consider the toxicity to be non-toxic as opposed to toxic. And they break them up by the various components here. This is just another line of evidence. Rather than just look at the individual compounds, all the metals are combined and looked at, all the PAHs are combined and looked at, and then all the different components are combined and looked at to give you something rather than just say this particular arsenic or copper or DDT was elevated. How do these things function in a group, in a mixture? Because that's really how they exist out there. Could you advance it for me, please? Another way of looking at it, which was slightly newer, is the logistics regression model. And the ones that I looked at were the ones done by Field and Norton. Jay Field's working for NOAA. And this is kind of a neater approach. It's a little bit more, it's got some slightly advantageous uses to it. It presents risk on a continuum, a scale, rather than dividing into discrete categories of not toxic, somewhere in the gray, and likely toxic. The continuum estimate allows the risk assessor to match the degree of risk to their objectives. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility in what you could do with it. And then they express the risk on a common scale of 0 to 1. And it provides a more direct avenue for assessing the risk of multiple chemicals. And so we were using the Pmax of 0.5. And if it exceeded 0.5, it would be considered toxic. The Pmax in this particular instance was always from the compound copper. Don't know why, but it didn't exceed 0.5. The average Pmax of the entire sample over all the samples, over all the analytes that were plugged into the model was 0.04. So it's an order of magnitude below the threshold toxicity for any of those, but the compound that seemed to contribute the most toxicity in this particular instance was copper. Could we advance it, please? Again, just another line of evidence. Another way one can look at it is the narcosis equilibrium partitioning equations that were developed by EPA some years ago. And this looks at the original 17 PAHs that were developed back in the 1970s. Historically, slightly under duress, EPA had to get these numbers out quick. They didn't have necessarily standards. PAHs are a small group of the semi-volatile organics. They're basically the worst of the compounds if one were to distill down fuel oils, although it's not quite coal tar, but it's pretty close. And toxic units, if it's above 1, you get toxicity. So I have 17 different PAHs that were calculated based on a number of their mechanistic characters. And if you go through the exercise and you punch it all out, you get these numbers in the second column under the toxic units for the 17 PAHs. Again, I think this may have reached its time. There are all of these PAHs have alkylated derivatives, which are probably, according to the literature, far more toxic and far more stable under environmental conditions. In other words, they like to hang around a little bit longer. So EPA developed a way of correcting it when these are collected in our samples, and they weren't collected on these particular analyses, where we can put in a correction factor and come out with a value. Again, we see that we're still an order of magnitude below the threshold of 1, trying to account for the additional alkylated PAHs that are in there. And there's other PAHs we could potentially look at. You can advance it, please. One of the things I've noticed when I get a lot of these things back from contractors, when they discuss the dioxins, the PCBs, and things of that nature, when they put them in confined disposal facilities, they don't really delve into what the interpretation of the dioxin number means. TCDD is the dioxin. That's the real bad one. That's the one that everybody associates with Agent Orange and things of that nature. And it's measured in parts per trillion. So it's really low. Some scientists would tell you that there is no level that's known to be safe with dioxin. It seems the lower we go in analyzing it, the more we find. But the state ESC on this, I believe, is 3.6. And okay, Bart wants me to wrap this up. Okay, get back to the discussion. This is the last slide. One thing I will tell you, the Canadians come up with a way in the second column where they're looking at fish using biota sediment accumulation factors and makes these things relevant to fish. So we were able to calculate these numbers and look at the PCB 126 number, which is the most toxic and most prevalent PCB congener out there, and again, evaluate it. The significance earlier is that these numbers are very, very low, and our number with total PCBs was less than 20 or 23. On that, I'm going to take Bart's advice and stop.
Thanks, Clay.
Mm-hmm.
That was a ton of information. I'm really glad we're going to be able to share slides with folks afterwards so they can process. But a ton of great information, and I know Bart will probe you on those a little further as we get into the discussion. Our next speaker, as Bill is getting ready to share the presentation, is Dr. Rob Meskowitz. He's an environmental engineer who's been working in the field of beneficial use of sediments for over 20 years. Rob specializes in assessing the potential impacts of beneficial use through field, laboratory, and modeling investigations of the fate and transport of contaminants and sediments. So Clay gave us a very thorough list of all the things to look out for, and hopefully Rob can expound upon how that may apply to projects and when we should start to worry. So as soon as your presentation shows up, Rob, I'll ask you to come on video and take it away.
Rob, sorry. I seem to, oh, there it is. Never mind. Okay, perfect. Just in time.
Okay.
And control.
While that comes up, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robert Miskowitz. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction. Obviously, you guys, we have regulators here, and there are water quality standards and sediment standards, and I'm just a silly academic, so standards are something that we know about, but I leave that to the experts who are actually going to use them. My presentation is going to be a little bit different because when I was thinking about this topic, what are the different ranges of uses that you can use material for habitat restoration? And I mean, beneficial use is something that's been being done throughout the state for a while now. And there are natural habitats that are not natural. There are habitats that are being restored, but there's also beneficial use in other areas where, you know, you're not talking about somewhat pristine areas. There are other places that sediment can be reused for habitat restoration. And what's interesting is it's going to have to be approached differently. So this is kind of an overview of a different, maybe looking at this in a different, or not a different way, but a little bit of a different viewpoint. Bill, is it open?
Second. Is your presentation not up?
It's not.
Oh, that's interesting.
All I see is, no.
Okay, I will share it this way.
We were seeing your other screen.
Oh, sorry about that. Is that it?
There it is.
Okay. And I'll give you control. My apologies.
No problem. All right, so there's my contact information, and this is us going out on the boats in various places throughout New York Harbor. So, but where's the next slide? There it is. Now, obviously, to the regulators, you're going to look at this slide, you're going to be horrified by the fact that I'm putting sediment into 3 categories of clean, impacted, and contaminated. And that's fine. I understand that. But when we look at the different projects that we've been working on, at least at Rutgers, is we look at projects where it's fairly clean. And that's a lot of the projects that we've been doing. I believe Scott is on this call. We've been doing a lot of work with Scott down in southern New Jersey. And that material, though, I know Suzanne mentioned various issues at Dredge Hole 86 and the Good Luck Point project. In those areas, the sediment is being used unamended. It's basically the sediment. You're going to have to jump through some regulatory loopholes, but the sediment is going in as sediment. The next one is impacted. Now, impacted is something we do up in New York Harbor. You can see the sediment that is in this picture. This is our New York Harbor black mayonnaise. This was taken directly out of the Arthur Kill. This material, it's not going to be placed on anything without having something done to it. And that sediment, we don't call it contaminated because it's not hazardous. We call it impacted because it does have certain things in it that are going to limit how you can use it, but it's not hazardous material. Contaminated sediments we look at as hazardous material. That's probably going to have a whole new regulatory pathway, and most likely that sediment is not going to be used for habitat restoration. All right, so I'm going to start off with impacted sediments real quick. This is a site that many of you probably have known and worked on. This is the Copper's Coke site. This used to be the Clean Earth facility where they did sediment amendments. In the beginning, it was a coal tar factory, highly contaminated, all kinds of things. And this was filled with 2 million cubic yards of material. And they did some marsh restoration on the edge, right as it borders the Hackensack. Now, I would not call this habitat restoration. There are parts of it that are pretty nice. It's certainly not going to be pristine, but it can be used for some sort of habitat. And one of the things that has been that I have recently been working with is a setup. This is some colleagues at Bionautics and the Gaia Institute that I've been working with, and Eric Stern, who many of you may know. We're coming up with a Vulcan tiering system. Now, if you look at this, you're talking about an eroded urban, waterfront. Now, the idea is, can you take an eroded urban waterfront and turn it into some sort of habitat? And the people, it's actually at Bionautics who came up with this design. The idea was we need to raise up the land surface. So we put contaminated or impacted sediment underneath, stabilize it, amend it with whatever needs to be amended with, and then build up a habitat layer on top. Now, obviously, this is not using dredge sediment for directly building a marsh. But what it's doing is you're creating a platform for the marsh to sit upon. And this is something that could be done in a lot of urban areas. This was actually proposed for the Gowanus Canal. Now, I mean, this is a possible use. And this is something that should be considered when we want to talk about habitats and we want to talk about improving habitats in urban areas, because most of the sediment that we're going to be dredging in urban areas, we're not going to ship them to other places. The whole idea is you have to have an end use somewhere near where you're dredging it. And this is a possibility for using impacted sediments to create marsh habitat in urban areas. And this is used for resiliency, and it can actually be fairly beneficial. Now, That, as far as impacted sediments though, most times when you talk about impacted urban sediments, you're not going to be putting them on top of a marsh. You're not going to be placing them in the water. They're going to be somehow sequestered from the environment. And in this case, that's what we're doing. Now, for cleaner sediments, what we've been finding is some of the, or at least, why is it not going forward? Sorry. We've been working on some projects when we've been talking about, and these are the cleaner areas. Now, this is a habitat restoration project in that it's dredge hole 86. Suzanne mentioned it before. We were not looking at the dredging area. We were actually looking in the dredge hole itself. The dredge hole is about 60 feet deep. The water all around it is about 3 feet deep. And the idea is use the sediment that's being dredged from Lakes Bay and put it into the hole and bring the level up in the hole so you no longer have an anoxic condition in that hole. And what we were asked to do was to monitor the suspended sediments, because when you look at placement of these materials, one of the things that is always considered the largest potential impact is a sediment plume spreading from your placement site. And so we were asked to do measurements. We came up with a whole bunch of new turbidity probes and a real-time portal that can be used to measure the turbidity in real time, and we had it up on a dashboard. And what you can see from this data is during the placement window, we had very little suspended sediments occurring. And there were all kinds of reasons why, but what we found is outside the placement hole, there was essentially no turbidity. But this is a common thing, and being able to measure that turbidity in real time to be able to inform the people who are actually doing the work is something that's really an interesting development, and we were able to do it fairly well. And our results were great. They showed that there really was no spreading of the sediment beyond the actual placement site. Another place we were asked to do this was also at Good Luck Point. So obviously we seem to be going into similar places as Suzanne, but in Good Luck Point, this is not the fine sediments on the marsh. This is actually the Back Bay Beach was getting a linear bar put in, so it's in water placement. We were also asked to measure turbidity here, and we did a model to see how far the turbidity plume would go, and also to measure how much of the sediment actually remained in place on the beach. And what we found was through this whole project, the sediment was being discharged, and you can see in this. Bill, can you hit play on this?
I'll give that a shot.
There's on the bottom left, there's a little, oh, there we go.
There you go.
All right, so this is, we'll probably just let it go through a couple times, but you can see these red arrows. These red arrows are where the discharge from the dredge. Oh, it stopped. Okay, these are the different locations where the discharge was put. Okay, this is our sediment plume. Now you can see in the beginning, for the very beginning, when they were discharging on the point, we had a little bit of offshore vector, but that actually curled around. And for the rest of the time, as they were discharging, it was doing exactly what was planned. It was welding itself to the beach, and it ended up creating what was, although it was designed to be a straight linear bar, it ended up being a lobe of sand a little bit farther south, but most of that sand ended up welded to the beach. But we also can see that if you look at this plume, you can't really tell the units, but if you look at this sand plume, it's not going outside of the project area.
Wow.
there was very, very little measurements, and we had offshore measurements where you couldn't see anything. So this sand is just moving and getting spread in the project area, and then as we move down to the lower side. Now, one of the things that we learned out of this by doing this type of modeling, because this is a Delft 3D model, what we found is that there are other locations that we could, through this modeling, we can predict where these plumes are going to go based on tidal conditions, and we can optimize our placement operations. You know, we can put it into different locations where the currents, the natural currents themselves, will help mold it onto the beach and give us the structure that we want. Okay, this again is a NJDOT OMR project. Again, Scott's out here, so this is one of his projects. The next slide just shows that. Where's the next slide? Oh, yeah. This shows the results of the project, and you can see in our nearshore berm, there's about 2,500 yards. It just happens to mostly be located on the southern half. So the dredge material was placed all along around the point. A lot of it ended up on that southern end. But this is a very important aspect of placement, is what's actually going to be happening. In that you have to take into account not just what is going to be going on this marsh. What is the sediment quality, and what is the sediment quality of the sediment that you're placing there, but also what has the potential to move it on and off the marsh. And I think I've probably talked long enough. So that is my last slide, but we have a lot of other projects that we're working on where we're looking at the transport of sediments in the water column or across a marsh that we can talk about at any point. I actually have a couple other videos that are very interesting and show that.
That's great, Rob. We may have an opportunity for you to share those videos if you can send hyperlinks in the follow-up materials. Sure. If folks are interested. So sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's always great to get multiple perspectives on what really matters. The presentations are coming together just like I imagined. So I appreciate everybody being here today. So our last presentation is actually from one of the Learning Network organizing committee's own. So David Steinman is a soil scientist for the USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and the Soil Survey Office Leader for the Hamilton Soil Survey Office, which is responsible for updating the soil survey for the coastal plain areas of New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. Over the past 6 years, David has specifically concentrated on updating, mapping, and interpreting the soils of the coastal zone areas, which include tidal marshes, subaqueous soils, nearshore soils, and developing a better coastal zone soil survey product. So in addition, David was a participant in the post-implementation sampling that was done at the Avalon Beneficial Use project. So I'll sing his praises there and let him take it away.
Thanks, Adriana. As Adriana said, I'm a soil scientist for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, and I just want to go over a few soil properties that you should consider when planning or monitoring these beneficial use projects. These aren't regulations or requirements, but more of suggestions or things to consider when developing a project. So I'm just going to go through a few things, some considerations in the placement site, some soil considerations in the dredge material, some post-placement monitoring, and some things that we in NRCS and USDA are doing in the coastal zone and specifically with beneficial use. So a few things that considerations you should probably look into at the placement site are the existing site platform condition, the platform of the marsh or beach or area that you're looking to restore. There's plenty of tools out there that you can sort of remote sense this kind of thing, but it never hurts to walk around and get an idea of the site. You can always walk and see if you're sinking. If you're sinking, your platform weight stability is affected. Is the area ditched or pooled or ponded? It doesn't also hurt to look under the surface and take a shovel slice or an auger, sort of like the picture there to the right, and see what's under the surface before placing things on the site. So a few things, some other things, the soil series or the type. Is the soil on the site mineral or is it organic? If it's mineral, what type of material is it? Is it sands or is it silts? That could relate to your bearing capacity or the ability to withstand that placement. Also, if it's organic, how thick is the organic material that's on the surface? That could become an issue when you place material on it and compact that that soil organic material. Also, your platform weight stability as you're walking around. You might have a solid, firm surface where you can walk really easily, like walking down the street, or you could have a really, really soupy, soft, really fluid material where you'll sink sort of up to your knees. To get an idea of that, just walking around the site. Also, the geomorphic setting and landform. This comes into effect more once you characterize the dredge material that you have, but it's a good idea to know, obviously, if you're on a marsh or a beach dune. Also, if you're on the barrier side or mainland side or riverine system, it'll tell you a little bit more about the soils you have on the site. And then something that's going to sort of be a reoccurring thing you'll see across a couple of these slides is the acid sulfate potential. Most of these coastal submerged soils have the potential to become extremely acidic upon oxidation. So you really want to be careful and to know that potential is there or isn't there. In most cases, it likely is there. So just knowing that would be pretty critical. So some dredge material considerations, again, the acid sulfate soil potential of the dredge materials. One way to look at this or to figure this out is to do an incubated pH test, which takes a little bit of time, but at least you'll know that you have sulfitic materials or materials that can oxidize and rapidly decrease in pH. And then some other soil characterization data is textural analysis, texture or grain size ties into maybe your geomorphic setting of the restoration site and could potentially restrict the type of project you intend on doing. If you have more of a dominant sand texture, you might want to think about maybe a beach or a dune restoration, whereas with silts and clays, you may not want to put that on a beach or dune with higher energy that'll just be susceptible to erosion. May be more essential for silt or for a thin layer project instead of a dune or beach restoration. So some other things are the pH, the oxidized pH, as I said, for the acid sulfate potential, the electrical conductivity, and the maybe the bulk density compared and contrast it for plantings maybe or vegetation reestablishment. And then as a few other people have been talking about potential contaminants. Some post-placement considerations or things to monitor once placement has occurred. Again, the acid sulfate potential, this is where it becomes critical in managing and keeping this material moist, restoring the hydrology, and avoiding the drying out of these areas. The potential is going to be there likely in these coastal marshes. It's just managing and keeping the material moist and prohibiting that reaction from taking place. Some other things to monitor while you're out on the site post-placement, maybe if you're doing monitoring for other things, you can take a few soil monitoring attributes, pH, maybe in a few locations in your higher elevation areas, maybe some in your lower elevation, some middle elevation, compare that, see if your pHs are dropping, and maybe that'll give you an idea of some managing things to figure out to mitigate that. Also, you can look for redoxamorphic features, surface cracks, jarosite precipitations. This is all going to be tied back to the acid sulfate potential and give you an indication if that's areas beginning to dry out. And then your placement and dewatering and subsidence, the thicker and finer the soil textures are going to be, it's going to take a lot longer for those areas to dewater and could stay in that state for quite a bit of time. So it'll be hard to walk across. It'll be hard to reestablish that vegetation sort of in those thicker areas. And as these areas start to dewater, they're probably likely going to lose quite a bit of elevation. So a few things there. So some so just a few pictures up here in the left. I have surface cracks in the bottom there. In the bottom left, there's surface cracks with jarosite precipitation around the surface cracks, the yellows and oranges. And then on the right, we have some pictures of some redoxamorphic features. So these are all indications that these areas are drying out and active acid sulfate conditions are beginning to take place. I believe the redoxamorphic features, that soil horizon had a pH of less than 4. So just to give everyone an idea of the potential or the potency of these types of soils. So real quick, I just wanted to go through a few things that NRCS has been doing in the coastal zone and with beneficial use. We have a national coastal zone soil survey focus team, teams with soil scientists around the country dedicated and working in these coastal zone areas. As Adriana said, we're all updating and more accurately mapping the soils of the coastal areas. We have technical guidance we develop on this team. We have a technical note for acid sulfate soils in coastal and subaqueous environments. We also develop soil interpretations. Once these areas are mapped and delineated, we develop interpretations, and we have a land utilization of dredge material, which I'll show on the next slide, some substrate classes, restoration suitability, and working on a ton more. And we also, in some areas, are beginning to delineate some of these thin layer phases or thin layer projects and putting phases of map units on these with maybe a sand surface or a silty surface or some things like that, which I'll show in the next slide as well. So this is a link to Web Soil Survey. If anyone has or hasn't been on there, that's the way we store and provide our soils data to the public. This is a snapshot of that over here on the right, and this is the land utilization of dredge materials interpretation running with all these red areas. It's likely having sulfidic materials being the limiting factor, but so that's that there. And then here on the left is an example of the sanded surface phase of the delineation of the sanded surface phase for the beneficial reuse or thin layer project up in New England. So these areas with the beneficial use or thin layer interpret a little bit differently. So that's why we sort of do that. And this product is Soil Web, which is a little bit more user friendly than Web Soil Survey. So I just want to thank everyone for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate all of our presenters this morning and the information that you guys have shared. I am eager to share the slides. I'll send the slide deck out as a PDF to all of our participants here, along with the recording of this presentation, so that you guys can digest at your own speed. At this point, we're going to shift gears and go into our moderated discussion. So I'd ask all of our presenters, if you're able to go ahead and turn your video back on while I introduce our 2 additional panelists and our moderator for this discussion. So I'd like to welcome Allison Rogerson. She's an environmental scientist for Delaware's DNREC Division of Watershed Stewardship in Dover, Delaware. She has worked with the Wetland Monitoring and Assessment Program for 14 years, mapping wetlands, measuring wetland condition, and experimenting with wetland restoration techniques. Allison's practical experience working with Bart Wilson on a thin layer placement project in 2013. And she's currently planning a marsh restoration project in DNREC's shoreline and waterway management section, along with Ashley Norton. So thank you for being here, Allison. We're really excited to have you and your expertise on the panel today. Additionally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lenore Tedesco. She's the Executive Director at the Wetlands Institute, a research and education center in Stone Harbor, New Jersey. She holds a PhD in marine geology and geophysics with a focus in sedimentation and fluid dynamics. She's worked on the planning, implementation, and monitoring of beneficial use projects in the 7 Mile Island Innovation Lab in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers Philadelphia District, ERDIC, and the state of New Jersey. Lenore is working with ERDIC teams on sediment transport and dynamics at 2 of the beneficial use sites, which are Gull Island and Sturgeon Island, and their placement areas. So welcome, Lenore. Thank you I'm glad you aren't in the field today so you could be with us. Finally, I'd like to welcome our illustrious moderator, Bart Wilson. He's a geomorphologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ecological Services Restoration Division. He works with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programs and partners throughout the Northeast region and East Coast on coastal restoration, climate change, coastal hazards, and emerging issues. Bart holds a BA in paleoecology and an MS and PhD in coastal geology from the University of Delaware. He's a licensed professional geologist, and he will be our moderator. So before we jump into that discussion, which we have an hour left for questions, so I think we're gonna pop around a little bit. The organizing committee has prepared a series of questions, but I want to invite our audience and participants to jump on that train whenever the spirit moves you. So go ahead and pop questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll use this next hour to address questions kind of from both directions. So as we go into, when we're thinking about this moderating session, we were creating the session and inviting folks. We've tried to consider what types of things you practitioners might need to know about source sediment as you plan, and how does that information get included in design, implementation, and monitoring. And ultimately, we understand the answer to many of the questions that we're about to ask, and the context for interpreting the shared wisdom will be, it depends. It'll depend on site characteristics, project goals, and the available sediment, which is why in these sessions, we share expertise and examples. And so we try to share examples because they're a valuable set of resources. So when possible, we're going to ask our panelists to help us map out some of those examples by being sure to indicate when and under what conditions your answers may apply. And it's always okay to say, I don't know, or we haven't tried that. So we've got, like I said, the next hour to dig into questions, and I will hand it over to Bart to kick us off. And I'll be moderating the chat and kind of peppering those in as well.
Great. Well, so thank you, Adriana, and thank you all speakers. That was wonderful. And I think you guys were too prepared, and that's a good thing. So I was on the fly changing my questions that I was going to ask you guys. So this was actually very good that everyone did a really good job of kind of really hitting a lot of the different things. So I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I'm also going to try to bridge some of the areas together, because I think, as many of you know, within beneficial use and elevation enhancement projects, a lot of these things are not mutually exclusive. They kind of run the gamut and kind of mesh together. So one thing I want to kind of start with from a contaminant standpoint is, Suzanne and Clay, you guys did a good job of starting to talk about some of that. But one of the things I do want to kind of take a step back and have you guys talk a little bit about is, contaminants in the waterways, where I think some people have an idyllic idea of the contaminants that are out there from, you have background levels of different things, and then you can also have hot spots. So I think if you guys want to talk a little bit about from what you guys are seeing, what are some of the, obviously if we're in a marina, we know we're going to have issues, but what are some of the things that you guys see out there with regards to kind of distribution of contaminants, but also maybe some of the emerging trends or emerging contaminants that we're not really thinking about?
Is Susan still with us?
I don't know. I was just looking.
Was
Well, if you
a
want,
minute ago.
Yeah. Background's a tough question. That's by where you're at, what's coming around, what's out there, what's dropping out of the sky. Background can only be attained through looking at a lot of samples over a lot of spatial area, and everything shifting around constantly out there. So that's kind of a difficult one. As far as hotspots down along the coast, the samples that I've looked at in southern Jersey, Ocean, Monmouth, and Atlantic County, Cape May County, the marinas really, the private marinas aren't really all that remarkable to speak of. You do see some PAHs, but again, I think we can improve the PAH sampling regime. To Robert, I've worked on the Passaic River, Newark Bay. That sludge that he showed us, that's contaminated. The only thing it was missing was a Technicolor sheen on top of it. But that's black mayonnaise. When you talk about something that I would not offer for ecological restoration below where Robert was mentioning, maybe use it for a basis. And let's be realistic, up in that neck of the woods, there's a lot of what's called ISRA material, old fill, industrial material like timbers, coal tar, ash from furnaces and whatnot that were used to fill the banks along the Passaic and the Hackensack and places like that. It's regulated. You can use that for a base to build an upland on. As far as other emerging trends, PFAS, although the toxicology on that's very young, pharmaceuticals and personal healthcare products, they're not removed by wastewater treatment facilities very well. And so that's something one wants to consider when you're looking at where are the discharges from local sewer plants going relative to where your material is at, and whether or not those compounds, which can be pharmaceuticals, Prozac, caffeine, stuff of that nature, or things that cause the waters and the sediments to become both anti-estrogenic or estrogenic and create a soup like we have in the Passaic River where the critters don't know what they're doing. That's not really the case down in these areas that we've looked at thus far. So I'm gonna step away from North Jersey and just say, background and hotspots, the background is what the background is, and only further sampling is going to help us refine that. As for hotspot, that's you're dealing with very heterogeneous areas out there, so hotspots are going to probably be associated with point sources.
thanks, Clay. Kind of moving a little bit more towards sediment quantity or kind of more physical properties of it. I think a big thing we always talk about is how you kind of start some of these projects. The Corps comes and says, hey, we have a dredging project. Do you want to work with us? Allison, Lenore, I ask you guys, what are some ways to think about, what are the kind of most important questions to ask when, someone's approaching you with saying, hey, we have sediment? What were some of the ways you guys kind of think about that with, the questions you ask to kind of start setting up what you think you could do with it?
Yeah, thanks, Bart. I could start. This is Lenore. I think the keys really come down to, what's the grain size as kind of a first component. Is it sand? Is it mixed fine sand and clay? Because that controls kind of what you can do with it on the other side. how much do you have? Right? Do you have 6,000 cubic yards or 100,000 cubic yards? And then where is it? Because transport distances end up becoming a lot. So kind of with those three questions, you can then say, all right, you know, that's my starting point, and I can go from there. And the rest of the project design, you know, marsh restoration needs, habitat enhancement, all those things come out of those three key points from my experiences.
And I would agree that composition definitely plays a role. And I would ask how far away, you know, where are you going to be doing the dredging, and how far away is a spot you can use it, because distance and shipping that sediment is an issue. And where you're going to put it, you know, is it similar? And I agree. How much are you going to be producing?
Well, and that brings up a great point. I think this is a two-part question, so I'll send this one to Lenore, Allison, and David first. So there's a term that a lot of people use in this called like for like. What do you guys think of the idea of like for like when you're thinking about putting sediment on a marsh surface? So, and I'll define that as like for like. Some people say that, you know, if it's a fine-grained marsh platform, you know, you need to put fine-grained material on it to do restoration. What are your guys' thoughts on that term?
I guess, hi, can you guys hear me? This is Suzanne Biggins.
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. We had previously tried to use that term when we were starting with the Engineered with Nature projects, and we ran into some difficulties with that from a contaminant profile in that, and that's kind of why we shifted more to a broad presentation of the data, comparison of the results, and then looking at background concentrations of sediment in the estuary, and not necessarily moving quickly onto the marsh surface and treating it like an SRP site and sampling the marsh surface so that we could do a comparison of like on like at like concentrations. So, you know, and to be honest, I think doing that may limit your ability to use material that comes from an adjacent waterway and putting it up on the marsh surface, because you know, there you're getting into, you know, various and sundry different dynamics that may be happening as that material is placed on the marsh surface. So that's kind of why we shifted away from that approach. I don't know, Lenore, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think there's the questions so one question is, what do you mean by like on like, as you've just addressed, as it relates to background or contaminants, or is it appropriate to have material that was, you know, anoxic and cold and dark suddenly up in you know, in an anoxic zone on a marsh surface? And obviously, you know, that was the experience I had, was as you addressed it. There's another way of thinking about it though too, and I think that was a little bit of what Bart was getting at, is how much does that play into thinking about project design? Would you put sand on mud? Do you need to have similar fine-grained and organic content material on your marsh? And to that, my answer is, it depends on what your project goals are. You know, and that's really the key. If I'm trying to create a sandy marshhead protection zone to break up waves, then I could put sand next to mud and peat channel that's at a higher energy, like kind of what we just saw at Good Luck Point. You know, I'm guessing that marsh wasn't sandy, but that was potentially you know, an appropriate use. Would I try to build marsh elevation for vegetation stabilization with sand on peat? Probably not. So I think, again, it's a bigger question. What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? We did put sand on marshes, but we were creating bird nesting habitat and not trying to restore a marsh. So depends on what your goals are and how that all factors in as to what material, you know, what you could do with the material depends on what your project goals are, more so than do I need to match material. Sometimes matching it's great because that fits your project goals and what you're trying to accomplish. I don't know if that's what you were trying to get at, Bart, with the way you asked the question.
Yes, yeah, and Allison and David, do you guys have anything you want to contribute to that?
Real quick,
I
just
would agree with Lenore that it depends. So Bart, at Piney Point, we chose to match. So the marsh platform that we were going to put thin layer of material on was already vegetated and it was silty. And so we wanted to match that because we didn't want to pile a bunch of sand on top of Spartina on a platform that was predominantly silt. And then that was our choice. And then the project that we're working on now is like a marsh recreation, so really a thick layer. And so I won't be as picky, we'll take whatever it is because we're just trying to build it up. As long as we don't reach a tipping point where our sand material would be so heavy that it would weigh down on the mud flat we're applying to and actually help it to sink. So that would be a factor to consider. Sorry, David.
no problem. I'm just going to agree with both Lenore and Allison with that, but also that the material it's placed there based on energy as well. So if you have a sandy beach, you're not going to want to put silts and clays on there. As Lenore said, you definitely want to know the goal or the end of your project. So
Great. Another thing to think about, get people's perspective, is the idea of kind of leading off a little bit that question of, you're talking with your dredging contractor and they say, you're going to have, 50,000 cubic yards of material. And you say, great, sounds good. And we're going to do our project in 2 years because, permitting, design, all these things. So what are some things to think about for projects with the idea of, project design, knowing that, your contractor may say, yes, it's 90% silt, but then also things like variations in quantity and having more material than your site you're planning for. So what are some things, if people want to kind of interject about some of the uncertainties associated with not only sediment amounts, but also, basically the grain size? What are some maybe tips people could give on those types of ideas?
I would say that's probably more the norm than the than the odd situation. You end up with different volumes than you thought, and you also end up with there's variability, right? And it's pretty rare that this channel is, or whatever the dredge source area is as uniform as the sampling the geotech told you it was. And I think TNC and DEP talked a lot about this at the Fortescue site in some of the earlier presentations, right? They ended up with sandier stuff. I mean, Scott Douglas has talked about that. I think the idea is you have to have, have some other ideas in your pocket, have alternate plans, assume that's going to happen. And you may need to have, if this, then that, and just to have a wider range of targets. I don't think I think it's risky to go in and say, I need 42,000 cubic yards of material to achieve this over this range, because that's just, you're not going to hit those. So just being more realistic in terms of the scaling and the way you think about your projects, and then having, if all this happens and this is all built out, then the other site, I'll go over here and do more about that. And I'm sure there's a lot of examples about that. And I said, I do know Fortescue, that was pretty much the standard of what was happening at Fortescue. It was one of the early projects, and they handled that really well by having an alternate site. They got a lot more sand, so they were able to build the dune and the beach instead of doing the marsh restoration. So it's flexibility, but thinking that through on the front side and actually anticipating that rather than being surprised by it.
And I'll just add that absolutely there's going to be variability, and there's not much you can do to prevent that. It's going to happen. In our case, we wanted to seek out the silt and not the sand, and so that was up to our dredge crew operators to be really vigilant and pay attention and just take the top layers as they were moving the cutter head across in the channel and watching what the sediment, the slurry that was coming out. And if it was dark and silty, they were good. As soon as they started to hit sand and that changed, they would stop and pull it up and reposition. And so there was some flexibility there, but you have to stay flexible and make some estimates to say, hey, we want to move around, so that you can try and make a guesstimate of how much you're applying. But it's so much water that it's really a guessing game of exactly how much you have coming out. So just trying to make some measurements on the fly as things settle down. And, you know, with this project, the bigger project that we're planning now, where it's really a thick layer and we really want to apply so much, applying it in smaller cells and moving down the line and then letting them settle and coming back and seeing how things look when they dewater and just giving them a chance and like reassessing the situation and then saying, okay, we got half, we need more.
That's great. So one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is that, you know, with most of these dredging projects, you'll get a full list of, you know, from the person doing the dredging, you'll get this whole list of different analysis, both, you know, chemistry and then contaminants, different things like that. So I think one of the things I think would be helpful, you know, especially David, if you want to kind of take a couple minutes and think about what do people really need to think about when they look at this list of contaminants? Because again, you can get a list of whatever, or people can say, well, what do you want us to sample for if you're having concerns about more of the geochemistry? What are some ways to kind of think about that, or where are some good resources that people can go to kind of learn more about those aspects rather than just getting a 4-page list of analysis?
Right. So we have developed a technical note for sulfidic materials in coastal and subaqueous soils. So that's something that I can send a link out in the reference materials that'll go through the sulfidic materials and how to test for them, what to look for, what's sulfidic, how to classify them, how to characterize them. And that would all be based on like oxidized pH and things like that. And also I think grain size and soil texture is really important in testing and looking into the dredge material, so that you do have an idea of what to do with that placement material, and maybe come up with an idea of maybe a project or an area or two, that if you have sand, maybe you can go here. I know it's not that easy with the dredge operators, but if you have silts, then maybe you can go here, maybe like two options for each one. So just so you have an idea of what to expect.
That's great. Now, I think something, you know, Clay and Rob and Dave, I think another question for you guys is that, you know, the geochemistry and some of the contaminants, it's not as simple as just, you know, it's there, it's going to be an issue. The geochemistry, the setting has a big part to play in it. So how do you guys think about that with, you know, something may be there, but is it going to become an issue? And I know, David, you touched a little bit about this, but if you guys want to talk about that, not only from geochemistry, but then, you know, Clay and Rob talk about, you know, how, when you start looking at something being there, a lot of these constituents are there everywhere. They're pretty ubiquitous. When is it going to be an issue? And I'm thinking aerobic, anaerobic conditions. If you want to kind of talk a little bit about how it's not as simple as it just being present. If you want to go ahead first, like Clay and Rob, you can go ahead first and from a contaminant perspective.
Clay, you want to go first?
Oh, Rob, please.
All right. Well, it's a lot of this has to do with, you know, it's the whole idea that toxicity is based on a pathway and how something can get out. So it depends on the soil chemistry, what's there, but also, you know, one of the big issues is it flooding? Is it adequately flooding like a marsh would normally function, or do you have areas that are not functioning that way? And it's, I think when you talk in terms of what are you looking for, well, you're looking for obviously the pH is going to, of the soil is going to have an impact, the redox potential, because these are things that are going to allow things to be released. Now, there are going to be other aspects as well. It also depends on how disturbed the sediment is. You know, when Clay was talking about things up in northern New Jersey, I know we're trying to get away from there, but some of the sediments are there, they're contaminated and they're undisturbed. So, you know, If you just leave them, then in theory, nothing is going to be released. So the things that go down into the sediments can actually have a way to release them, but the act of dredging may actually be more, or construction on those areas may be more hazardous than just letting them sit there. And that's something that needs to be considered is, are the actions that we're taking going to have any impact to the environment around it?
So I'll add to that a good point. A lot of times when we look at dredging or restoration up around the New York Harbor estuary, if the top material is going to be removed, we often ask them, why don't you go ahead and characterize the next 6 inches below that? Because that's going to be the new biologically active zone. And it could be that it's so deep, it's no longer contaminated. It could be that it's highly contaminated and maybe a 2-foot cap ought to be put back on top of it. That's one way to look at it. As Rob said, pathway. Pathway is everything here. The chemicals that I was mentioning, the ones that were most concerning to us are those that are hydrophobic and lipophilic. They don't like being in the water. They prefer to be in fat. And those are your organic compounds like DDT, PCBs, dioxins, furans, things of that nature. And those are mostly passed through the diet. So if the sediment is somewhat contaminated and it gets into the plankton and then moves up to the next level and into the mummy chog and into the young white perch and eventually up to the eagle, that's when it becomes problematic. It's dietary exposure for those particular chemicals. The metals, not so much. They're going to stay down on the lower trophic levels, exception mercury. That's the way I kind of look at it. So the pathway, once you're going to thin layer, this is your new biotic zone. And if you've got mummy chog going in and out of there, and they could be taking it up probably, that becomes the issue. So the pathway is no longer just the sediment, it's the food feeding over the sediment that moves up the pathway. And that's why that long list is selected to a lot of cases, is because there is acute toxicity carcinogenics with the semi-volatile organics, the PAHs and things like that. But when you get into the pesticides, you'll note that most of those are chlorine pesticides. They're not the newer phosphate ones. They're ecological wimps. They don't hang around long out in the environment. DDT, they'll hang around for decades. PCBs, decades. Dioxins probably got a shelf life of centuries. So they're going to hang around. They're bioavailable. They're very resilient, and they do bioaccumulate, and it's generally through the diet. So I think a lot of our concerns with exposure to the critters can be knocked down. To Dave's suggestions of acid sulfate, my general understanding of it and what I have seen in the past is what you wind up liberating there are irons, aluminum, manganese, maybe cadmium. These are all phytotoxic. So, sometimes I think a good land manager is going to sometimes be able to look with an eye and say, geez, why the hell's all my grass dying out there? And, maybe that pH is starting to go down. It gives them maybe just a little bit more indication of what's going on. So to Dave's comment about just get out there and look around and look for those subtleties is very prudent. Thank you.
Great.
Not to steal your thunder, but I just wanted to elevate a question that Scott Douglas asked in the chat. So he asked for the whole panel, I think taking this way back out to the full scale. Would you say is the biggest impediment to implementing large scale beneficial use projects? So anybody that wants to take that. Incredibly loaded question.
I can kind of jump into this because we've been dealing with this with NJDOT for a couple of years. To go large scale on a project, I think you would have to do a lot of background and assessments of the actual Engineer with Nature project to show that it's in need of a habitat restoration. And then match that up with necessary dredge material that can serve the purpose of restoring the area. I know everybody's probably familiar with a very old project that had come to the department as well as a bunch of regulatory agencies in Little Egg Harbor Township. And there it was a very large thin layer placement project, and there really wasn't the habitat assessment to show that it was degraded and in need of restoration. So I would say that would be the biggest kind of push from at least the regulatory agencies, that the location is in need of restoration and how best to go through that restoration project.
Thank you, Suzanne. Purpose and need keeps coming up in these discussions, and I think it's coming at you in a future webinar, so everyone stay tuned.
If we have time, I'll jump in and just say, in our case, I would say getting more project on the ground has been a matter of cost and comfort. So just finding a way to make these projects happen in a cost-effective way. So, we have some municipalities reaching out to us that need large scale projects, and the amount of money they need, they have to go around and cobble funding together from different sources, and they're not very familiar with that, and so they're not comfortable with it. And then there's also the comfort level of getting them permitted and answering the questions, such as biological need, as was just mentioned, and then just answering all the other what ifs, and just being comfortable with the plan and the design and such.
Great, thank you. So sometimes in the restoration community, we're asking ourselves, are there deal breakers? If the need is there, it may be a more complex project, but a lot of these issues, one of the reasons we wanted to surface some of these considerations for sediment and considerations of sediment is to surface some of these issues that may add complexity to your project. But are there some hard and fast deal breakers out there that we've encountered, or that our regulatory folks on the panel want to share? You've shared a ton of information so far, but in a world where you want to look for those big glaring red flags first and then navigate your way through.
Well, I'll just add from a contaminant point of view, we're pretty lucky down here that our contaminant inventory is relatively low, meaning along the South Jersey Shore, Cape May. The organochlorines, particularly the PCBs and the dioxin, their toxicity is additive. So it's not just that there's one of them there, it's that they're all there and they all have a similar mode of action, toxicologically speaking. And so when we start seeing a heavy burden of organochlorines or halogenated organics, that would give me pause. I sure would not want to put that on an environmentally sensitive area, or elevated mercury for that matter.
Sure, thanks, Clay.
Adriana, I'll add one quick thing to that question and kind of challenging the panel. I think within the practitioners, there is an undercurrent that we're going through a period of over-engineering, and there's too much of a microscope. It's almost becoming what people are trying to do is almost idyllic in the restoration. And, restoration should be messy. It's not going to be perfect. And the joke is that, you're not building a parking lot. So there's going to be some uncertainty. There needs to be some gradation. It's not absolute. I want to hear what people would have to say about that idea of, especially in the sense of, we're losing the battle for wetlands with regards to sea level rise and climate change, especially in the mid-Atlantic. So if we really want to make a big impact, we kind of have to upscale, take more risks. So kind of what's everyone's view of that idea of where we are with, you know, the state of restoration and kind of beneficial reuse?
Art, I'll chime in. We've been working on several of these projects, and it's in the presentation I showed that they had designed a parallel bar that had a 15-foot crest with 1 to 100, or I believe it was 1 to 10 slopes on each side, but it was sand being put into the water. There was no way that they were going to build a perfectly trapezoidal berm parallel to the shore. Now, you know, for design purposes, it was great, but we knew what was going to happen. And we knew that the sand was going to go wherever the current took it. And at least the group that I'm working with is we're trying to think of how can we predict how nature is actually going to move the sand rather than are we going to build an engineered structure. And there's a couple projects where we're working on, you know, one of the best ways to move sediment if you're pumping sediment is let the tide actually carry some of the sediments and bring it into the low level areas on the marsh. Now, there's no way you're going to design that because the water is going to go where the water is going to go. And we have to, now it may not go where we want it to go, but we have to end up doing adaptive management as we go. And that may be tweaking the design. But what we're finding is the best way that we're dealing with is we're doing sediment transport modeling beforehand and seeing if we can put it in the right location. And rather than building these very highly engineered structures, think of it more as a process design than an actual design of a structure. And putting it forward and making it an opportunity for the natural processes to start working again. Think of like the sand engine that they built in the Netherlands. You know, if we put the sand in the right place, we know where it's going to get carried because this is how it used to work before. And if we can replenish the sand source, that may be more effective than putting a shore protection structure to try to keep the sand, you know, where we want it, where we actually put it. So that's something that we've been working with.
Yeah, good. No, I was going to say, we're trying to do the same thing with fine grain materials on marsh surfaces, and that's the idea of letting the tides move it around. And I think, and we've had great success with that, right? These are sediment. Part of the challenge is these are sediment-starved systems. So the idea of engineering with nature is, right, putting sediment back in the system. That's beneficial use, right? Get the sediment back in the system. And the idea of designing for process is one part of it. Another way to think about it is designing, you know, to use those processes to help you achieve your goals. And that's really what we're dancing around at, is two little components of this. One is containment, right? To contain or not to contain, you know, that is the golden question here. And that causes problems, but maybe it creates some opportunities. But I think the biggest challenge for this is regulatory. It's the great fear of turbidity, you know, the scary big dark black cloud of turbidity, and where's it going to go? And really the unintended consequences of material going where we didn't intend it to go. And we've tried to move away from that by looking more holistically at the system and saying, you know, we're going to put material here. We know it's going to move in all these places. The elevation is going to let it play out, and we're going to design for a series of different project endpoints that are process based. And you know, we had the fortune of being able to do that as one of the projects in 7 Mile Island Innovation Lab, because it is an innovation lab. It was designed after the Dutch concepts you're referring to be innovative, to try things with, you know, and study them and understand them to try to inform process. And I think at the end of the day, you know, if we really want to see bigger projects that are more innovative, that where this becomes more of the norm, where we can actually really start attacking, you know, to get at, we're losing the battle for wetlands. We have to get to a place where there's more comfort and more acceptance of trying some of these things. We're probably not going to always get it right. But maybe as we can move, I think we are moving away from, do no harm to understanding that by doing nothing, we are doing harm. So trying to find that sweet spot in comfort level, in regulatory side, in how all this works together. To me, those are the biggest challenges we have. And I would add that into Scott's questions. What are the biggest impediments? And I think it's the comfort level of what are we doing? And I guess flipped it as how bad is it really for some of these ecosystems? And,
Yeah, I guess kind of speaking from the regulator, I know that we've had to over the years have had to get a better understanding of, sediment transport, these types of projects. And I think, Rob, you hit on it. We've also had to embrace the idea of adaptive management. From a regulatory, our common thing is, this is a construction permit. We're issuing you a construction permit. We need to know exactly what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and where are all the structures. Whereas we've kind of shifted with the Engineered with Nature projects, working with conceptual plans, having a clear understanding of sediment transport for these projects, and then having a very robust adaptive management plan that everybody kind of embraces to say, look, when we get in there, this may happen and we're going to react in this way, or we're going to look at it this way. I'm the first to admit that over the years, that has been a learning curve for me as the regulator of this type of projects. But I think we have a number of good projects under our belt that show, as Lenora was alluding to, some of the sediment transport, that it's not causing the anticipated impacts to the adjacent environments that are sensitive in nature of themselves. So, I think that is a way to kind of amp up a bigger project, is to have a clear adaptive management plan and a sediment transport study done before you proceed.
That's great, Suzanne. I really appreciate that insight. And I think one of the next topics, you guys are queuing this up for me as if I scripted it. So thank you, whether you knew it or not. One of the upcoming topics that we've discussed delivering our next webinar on is designing and implementing projects with sediment. So getting a sense of what tools are out there. And I think it's really interesting, Suzanne, that you brought up that permits are designed for construction projects, and these are a lot squishier than your typical construction projects. And how do we meet in the middle and build trust and gather information so that everybody can be comfortable and everybody can cover their collective bottoms with adaptive management and those kinds of strategies. So Bart, were you able to ask any more questions? I know you went mobile without notice, so.
I mean, I think we hit most of the large things. I don't know if there was any other comments in the chats that anyone had.
I don't see any other comments. We can do a last call for questions and or last things that anyone on the panel wanted to speak into the room on the topic of sediment and the importance of understanding it first. I'll give you a few seconds to unmute and respond. Otherwise, I'll wrap up and give us all some time back. Hearing and seeing none. I don't know if you guys can hear the rooster at my house. He also agrees it's time to wrap up. So I'd like to take this time to thank our experts. I appreciate all of our presenters and panelists, our moderator, and the organizing committee that helped us pull together this webinar. The Learning Network's goal is really to catalog and organize valuable information that we're able to surface through these webinars and have these discussions. I don't think really there's a roadmap yet, but if we all are mapping the hazards or understanding those together, we can find a way forward. So through the webinars, we're working with a broad group of stakeholders, and we're working in earnest over the next 6 months to produce monthly webinars, and also knitting that information together, not just in the recordings and in a recording library, but being able to get that information into a shareable and useful format. So you may see some survey questions and things like that coming from us as we work to create resources that will best serve you guys, our stakeholders and participants. I'm also, as I alluded, pulling together our mid-May webinar. We have 2 competing ideas, and we may try to deliver on both of them. So as I alluded, being able to speak on our next webinar on designing and implementing projects with Sediment. So bringing back everyone's favorite NJDOT expert and others, hopefully, on building some of these projects and the techniques that are there, also coupled with some of the engineering side as well. May also seems like a really apt time for us to just throw together an Ask Us Anything advice panel, knowing that NIF-WIF Coastal Resilience final proposals will be due in May. And rather than stick strictly to our plan, design, implement, monitor, adapt timeline of a project, which is essentially the arc we're going to be following with our webinars coming forward, we thought we'd give everyone an opportunity to skip ahead and convene a panel of experts on beneficial use for anyone to bring their burning questions as they're forming projects going into this spring. So more on that coming soon when we work together as an organizing committee to get that information out. I'll be sending a calendar invite your way soon. So hopefully then wrapping up on this topic, by the end of the week, you'll receive a link for the recording of today's webinar, a survey link to gather feedback, as I alluded. You guys are the audience we're serving, so we want to make sure we're doing that, and asking you questions is a great way to get feedback. We really do take these responses to heart and make adjustments as necessary. This is our first topic-centered rather than project-centered webinar, so we're really interested in hearing how that went for everybody. In closing, I just really wanted to say thank you to everybody, especially Bill Shadle, for catching when my Wi-Fi failed, and for everybody's participation and hanging on here on this sunny Tuesday afternoon. Appreciate everyone, and I'll be in touch soon with more information.
Thanks, Adriana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks
Hi,
all.
everybody.